Every white person in this country knows one thing. They would not like to be black here. If they know that, then they know everything they need to know, and whatever else they say is a lie. We have been living in a lie for 250 years.
Welcome to Truth and Reckoning, a broadcast from CELDF. In this show, we'll learn from frontline organizers and communities fighting against environmental destruction. We'll explore different perspectives and innovative strategies for movement building, the potency and the potential of rights of nature, and effective action in defense of our communities. And we'll share inspiring stories of people working towards right relationship with the land and each other. I am your host, Max Wilbert.
Joining me here today is Anthony Carifa. Rogers, right? Is that how you did I say that correctly?
Yes, you nailed it. You nailed it. I'm
Okay.
going to have to send you a prize. You nailed it.
Yeah. Well, my name also has a bag of prize that goes with it, so I hear you. I was just thinking like how to kind of get people familiar with who you are, and instead of me just kind of reading the normal bio stuff, I mean, maybe just throw out a couple things that you're got your hands in right now to give people a sense of who you are.
I am the proud son of two Sierra Leonean immigrants, first and foremost. I am a proud anti-Zionist Black Jew. My Jewish values, I think, really form a foundation in addition to the many lessons from Sierra Leonean parents and family that I've received over the years. I don't like to use the term activist. I prefer justice seeker.
Good.
That's a bit better. A father, I better throw that in there, and soon to be a newer father still, right? That's kind of important. And I just think at the end of the day, a consummate and perpetual and quotidian student. One of my favorite lines from a band called Fish, who I've seen like over 400 times from Vermont, believe it or not. They have a line that is, anything is possible when you've only been alive for 24 hours. And I think that if you wake up every day with that mindset, but there's no telling what you can learn. So at the end of the day, justice seeker, really focusing on climate and environmental justice and racial justice as well, and justice for poor and working class people writ large. I think that any efforts to discuss and achieve climate justice, which some now are referring to as climate liberation, must absolutely include racial justice and must absolutely include class justice for poor people of all walks of life, must include gender justice. So I am a hodgepodge of things, Kai. I'm a collage.
I mean, I got connected to you through your writing, specifically through the Black Agenda report. No, you're pretty frequent poster to that site, and just really resonated with your critique, your systemic critique. Also, I've dove into your pieces about, really the human struggle, and then even more specifically, of course, the struggle of Black people in the United States and Black people across the world. You're down in Colombia right now for a climate justice event, and you and I were just chatting about how, I mean, just mind-blowingly crazy it is that in this conversation in a country, as you were saying, that's 30%, African descent, just being recognized as people as part of the conversation is needing to be part of the conversation.
Right.
And how outrageous it is, as it's supposed to be focused on the realities of stopping fossil fuel use, and the, here again, that, the doors are closed, the windows are shuttered, to a whole group of people, which, advantageously to our time together fits in well with the topic at hand, sadly so. We're here to talk about the Declaration of Independence, what that's actually meant to Black people in the United States, the the systemic racism question, all the little entry points that you and I had talked about a couple of weeks ago in preparation for this, and as we've been chatting before we started here today. So we as an organization, CELDF, started this project called America 250, a revolutionary perspective. And we've been trying different ways to get into kind of pulling out that period of time, pulling out that document, not merely to sort of dust it off from a historical sense, but what has it actually meant today? What has it actually meant for the future? One of the areas that we were obviously very much wanting to focus down on is the systemic racism, the systemic sexism that is our reality. But how do you reconcile that with something that has these words in it, has had a narrative that's gone with it, true or not? And most specifically today, talking about what has that really meant, for you as a Black person in the United States, what's that meant for the Black community, the Black struggle, the Black experience? Yeah, so that's kind of where we're taking people today through the Truth and Reckoning podcast here. And I know I sent you
Small
questions.
topic, right?
Yeah.
just an itty bitty topic.
Yeah, just tiny. Yeah, well, we should be done in 10 minutes. And people can be on their way. I sent you a bunch of questions. We chewed on some things. As you said, this conversation could last days. But I thought of another question to kind of kick us off here, which is, can you recall what your first experience was with the Declaration of Independence? Like either hearing about it, maybe the first time you've read it, maybe the last time you've actually sat down to read it. Do you recall what was going on in your head or what you viscerally felt when you encountered that one way or the other?
Wow. That is such an incredible question. And I don't know if my answer is fully accurate. I'm answering just from memory. And if I'm being honest, I think the first time, right, we have this thing in the United States called Flag Day. And it typically happens in June. And, on the East Coast where I grew up, unlike, the Midwest and some West Coast states, you get out of school in kind of mid to late June. Right. And then come back to school after Labor Day in September. So we had this Flag Day and, there's all this patriotism and the Declaration of Independence. I just remember, gosh, I'm aging myself, Kai, right? We watched this slideshow. Remember the old slide projectors that had the film, protruding out as your teacher is literally spinning it. And there was this accompanying recording, right? You had to press and sequence the recording at the same time as the slides. I don't know how the teachers did it, but just as basically, this is the perfect document that sets America aside from all other nations in the world because everybody had the right to life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. And that's what we're talking about today when we pledge allegiance to our flag, and literally telling us as second graders, I think it was. And I was in a pretty majority white school at the time because this was when my mother and I were briefly living just outside of Princeton, New Jersey, right? She was working at Educational Testing Service before we moved to New York City. And so I think I was one of 3 Black kids in the entire school, right? This is Plainsboro, East Windsor, New Jersey. And, everyone just stood up after these second graders started clapping, and everything of just yay, USA. We start chanting USA. None of us had any idea why we were doing that, except for the fact that we didn't, knew this much later, that we were indoctrinated. So, that's when I'm, in single digits in age. And I don't think I really dug into it until high school, which also I kind of went to high school near that town in Princeton, right? I went to a Quaker boarding school in Pennsylvania because my mother refused to let me be a teenager in Giuliani's in New York City. Looking back on it, was probably a good idea, Mom. Thank you. And, had these great Quaker teachers who really wanted to get to the bottom of history and, made us read, what the 4th of July means to the slave, that written by one of the greatest orators and thinkers in U.S. history, of Frederick Douglass. And then really after reading that and then reading the Declaration of Independence again and knowing everything that we knew about the country and keeping in mind that this was still not necessarily including enough scholarship on what happened to indigenous people, right? Like this was still when we just kind of skipped over the fact that there was brutal land theft and genocide that was required for the United States to be settled. So now we're moving to college when this is finally being discussed, and it just makes you look at those words entirely differently, right? And then even later in life, when I start getting into more leftist writings, socialist writings, and whatnot, learning more about who the original settlers were in the first place, right? It wasn't like this group of poor people. Many of them came from sort of like what would be referred to today as the petty bourgeois, right? They were basically just looking for more land to expand their personal empires that weren't available in the old country anymore, and this required literally genocide of an entire population of people in order to facilitate and accommodate the liberty, right? The pursuit of happiness of a group of people who weren't even originally from here. And I think that once you get to that point in your life, if you're really being honest, if you're being objective and you're reading those words, knowing the full, Howard Zinn approach to the history of the United States, that was another book, right? You read Howard Zinn, and after you read Howard Zinn, which you have to like read in portions because it's almost too much truth that is combating a lot of the hyperbole and quite frankly lies that you've been indoctrinated with as someone who's been subjected to the public education system. And keep in mind, I'm a big proponent of public education. I'm just saying that this is what we were taught, in public education. You read Zinn, you learn about all these other things, and you can't look at the Declaration of Independence the same if you're being objective and if you're being honest. So yeah, there's been, I think like with everything else in life, there's evolution from being at the second grade to, sort of like aging myself again, unplugging myself from the matrix. Right. And being quite shocked. And I think that as we get more into our conversation, it comes back to the fact that truth is objective, but that doesn't necessarily mean the way that you receive it is objective, especially when you've been holding on to another truth basically your entire life. It can be painful, and maybe that's a good thing that it's painful as the process of awakening to reality, right? There's a difference between truth, which is not always synonymous with honesty, and reality, which absolutely is.
Yeah. It just shows that without really deep truth, without deep reckoning of the truth, right? How are we supposed to get beyond our realities, including the reality of systemic racism and all the unlearning that we need to do in order to learn.
Yes.
And so you kind of touched on it earlier, just as a way to kind of drive us into this discussion, especially around that particular document, which is from maybe from your own learnings, stuff you've investigated on your own, things that you were exposed to, let's say later in life through college, and just other people you've come across through all the amazing work that you're involved in. What's your sense of what it was like in the colonies in the in the late 1700s, in the sense of people's relationship or attitudes towards enslaved people, towards the enslaved Africans at that time, as well as like maybe weaving in what you've understood the attitudes of people were in England, right? Because at that time, the British still controlled the colonies, we're edging towards the Revolutionary War. As you mentioned, there's so many layers to that history around why people were here, meaning Europeans were here, not the indigenous people that were here for thousands of years already. But the Europeans that came, largely, of course, the British, and as you mentioned, there were speculators, right? There were opportunists. There weren't there weren't just the people who were escaping religious persecution or people who were basically debtors, right? They were enslaved to the land for the rich people, the rich British at the time. So you had a somewhat diverse population, let's say. It wasn't just monochromatic in the sense of who was here, but looking specifically at the question of how were people, what were the attitudes from what you understand, both let's say from the colonizers and the colonial people, not the colonizers, as well as the British at the time,
Yeah.
related to to people who were held in bondage.
I mean, sort of, and I'm saying this paradoxically, of course, the amazing thing is that what the British were fighting to hold on to was a very small portion of what is now known as the present day United States, right? This didn't even include the greatest land purchase of all time, right? The Mississippi River Basin, also the Louisiana Purchase, and certainly did not include California, the Pacific Northwest, which of course, and the Southwest, which of course we know is extremely integral to the economy of the present day U.S. So for the British to be willing to do anything and everything to hold on to these 13 colonies, right? Which still had so much immense amount of natural resources and land, and that was all commodified, says a lot that they were willing to do everything to hold on to what we know today to be pretty little, right? In the context of the landmass of the United States of America, so much so that they were willing to even grant freedom to enslaved African people who served the crown. And we'll get more into that in a moment. But at the end of the day, so many things, including people, were just seen as commodities, right? This really is where the U.S. or the colonies really where we get to see sort of what Lenin, V.I. Lenin, not John, referred to as monopoly capitalism, right? This idea that like we have to go and commodify everything to continue the in perpetuity expansion of capital in perpetuity, just unlimited and endless growth. So the attitudes. I think that the systemic attitudes was, y'all aren't people and as it pertains to African people, you're property, you're a commodity, you are necessary, whether you are a slave or you are a soldier in service to the crown, you are essentially what is necessary for us being, in this case, the British and those who are loyal to the crown, the loyalists, as they were, the Tories, as sometimes they were known, to keep this empire intact. And we are willing to sacrifice you as slaves. We are willing to sacrifice you as soldiers to keep it intact. But at the end of the day, what was not present, what was not in existence, was seeing these folk as humans. As a people who were humans even under God. So it's a very, very interesting relationship because these folks knew, of course, wow, these people bleed like we do. They need to eat like we do. They need sleep like we do, right? I mean, we know that, for instance, slaves, and at risk of sounding like a conservative GOP person, because they were commodities, because they were an investment, were kind of kept as healthy as some slave owners were willing to do. Slave owners would even say to their overseers, punish them, but don't beat them so much that they can't, produce more capital, that I can't use them as capital anymore. So a very, very interesting and what I would refer to as a ubiquitous contradiction. On the one hand, seeing these people who need everything that you need to survive, but at the same time using some sort of cognitive dissonance that clearly became willful to not see them as human, at the same time. And I wonder what that mindset, must have been like. And Kai, maybe we are seeing elements of that mindset today. We're seeing that mindset today. The Palestinians clearly are not seen as full humans by, the Israeli state that's oppressing them. You simply cannot slaughter that many people indiscriminately if you don't consciously dehumanize them. And we know that a lot of this was inherited. I mean, it's dark, so I just have to preface that. Adolf Hitler took a lot of the lessons from how the United States treated slaves and indigenous people, right? Used them against European Jewish people and others who were deemed unhuman and not fit to be, regular citizens in the Reich. And we see elements of that same mentality, of that same impediment. Let's just call it what it is, a psychological impediment that is being used against other people for many of the same reasons, for land, for dominance, right? And so that going back to your original question, that was the relationship. It was a relationship of contradictions. And then keeping in mind, last thing that I'll say on this is that the ultimate contradiction is that people were literally using something like the New Testament and elements of the Old Testament to rationalize what they were doing. A New Testament that was the gospel of a savior, who was all about equal humanity for all, and specifically the most downtrodden. This is a man who himself came from people who were once slaves in Egypt. So it's just very, very interesting. All kinds of contradictions and faulty parallelisms and cognitive dissonance kind of happening contemporaneously.
Yeah, which of course is how empire has to operate, right? It has to rationalize, normalize, and ultimately it legalizes, right? It has a progression, and it's sort of a interlocking approach. Of course, when it came to enslave people, a lot of people have written about it. W. E. Du Bois writes about, they had to rationalize European superiority in order to do what they did, right?
That's right. That's right.
The property orientation, of course, eventually from the American experience, becomes constitutionalized. It becomes legalized that slaves are property. They're not people. The 3/5 clause, all the other things, the piece in the Constitution that talks about, that we won't even consider the potential for the abolition of slavery until I think it was 1808. And because there was a calculation as well that we have a high chance of having a domestic population of enslaved people, meaning we may not need to import people from Africa anymore. So to talk about your sort of comment earlier about sort of the attitudes and the approach, it's quite stunning, and especially put up against the words in the Declaration, the words that I think probably echo through people's heads fairly accurately, but just to read it, it says, "We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal, that they are endowed by the Creator with certain unalienable rights, that among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness." Of course, we could pull that apart with the men being emphasized, where are the women, but putting all that aside, also reminded me there's a political cartoonist guy named Matt Worker that has this cartoon of basically the 1%, the Washingtons, the Hamiltons, and folks in Philadelphia, writing this, well, maybe not writing, maybe they were just channeling, of course, God in their, constructing of the U.S. Constitution. And Matt Worker has this picture of, in the cartoon, of this window that was open, which of course it wasn't. It was all boarded up, and there were armed guards around there because they didn't want the non 1% knowing what was going on. And in his pictures, everybody else, the slaves, the indigenous people, the commoners were all outside the window because they were not allowed in. And it's very interesting when we started our conversation here, the conference that you at, it's almost the same thing, right? Where you're on the outside, or there's no acknowledgement there. And I guess that it leads me to want to ask you, what has it been like for you or the Black community in the United States to navigate the reality of being Black in the United States, having these words that the Declaration puts out about equality, then having a U.S. Constitution that has nothing to do with equality for Black people? It's then 100 years later, basically, that you have the bloodiest, war on in the U.S. at the time that takes place to get to sort of the legal, abolition of slavery. I mean, again, like you said, so many contradictions and hypocrisies going on. I mean, what is the weight of all that, I guess, for being Black in America, knowing that this is, like you said, this is the truth. This is the history that I feel as a collection, as a society, we've never really confronted or reckoned with, let alone tried to get beyond it. So just curious what that's meant for you and for others that you've been in
You
conversation
know,
with?
it's interesting because I think that most, non-white folk, black, brown, certainly indigenous, wrestle with this as well. As a black person, ironically, it probably really came into a way that I could articulate it last year when I met a brilliant young professor named Brian Kooba. Brian was at the socialist conference that's held annually in Chicago, and he was doing a panel with the great Professor Kelly, right, on his panel from UCLA, on his book on Hubert Harrison, and it's called the Hidden and Forgotten Genius of Hubert Harrison. Hubert Harrison is someone that not just all black people and all oppressed people should know, but everyone should know, because this is an element of history that's kind of been ripped away from the history books, and with reason, as Brian, Professor Brian, as I call him, points out. Now, Hubert Harrison is a patriarch of, black radicalism in the United States. And he has this quote where he says, "The Negro is the touchstone of the modern democratic idea. The presence of the Negro puts our democracy to the proof and reveals the falsity of it." And of course, a touchstone is it's a hard dark stone that's used to place against other metals to determine the purity of that metal. So with Harrison basically saying the Negro is the touchstone, that's being rubbed against this democracy and proving that it's false. It's like, there's the way to articulate it. There's the way to articulate that, even as you noted, after a bloody civil war where the president of the United States at the time, Abraham Lincoln, it wasn't really an abolitionist, right? Was mainly about preserving the Union, much like the British, who we just spoke about, were willing to use Africans and black people to preserve the empire. Lincoln said it: if I can save the Union by keeping slavery intact, I totally will. So even after that, even after a civil rights epoch in the 1960s, which, if we're being honest, delivered some compromise bills in these Civil Rights Act of 64, Voting Rights Act of 65, neither of which that are necessarily intact, as much as they were when they first came out. And it could be argued, how intact have they ever been, right? There's de facto, there's de jure racism that both have to be navigated. And with everything, as I like to say, the United States is not a nation of laws, it's a nation of loopholes. If you really figure out how to perambulate that law legally, you can do it, right? We've got people who are paid a lot of money to help people cheat paying taxes legally or get out of paying taxes legally. And the same thing could be said for democracy. So what I would say is that it's both a miracle and a testament to the resilience of black people of navigating this, while also being inundated, less so now, right? I mean, I think more and more parents, which is a good thing, are starting to take a much bigger look and real direct look at their child's education, sometimes for the wrong reasons, because some parents absolutely hate the fact that we have a society now where we know that there's LGBTQIA teachers, students, administrators and whatnot. Some parents are against that. And we also have black parents that want to make sure that their kids aren't coming home with the history of the United States being slavery, Civil War, Martin Luther King, Barack Obama, freedom, So, navigating all of that while still being inundated with this lie of U.S. exceptionalism, with this lie of full U.S. democracy, is tough, because it does weigh on you emotionally. It does weigh on you mentally. The weight of both of those elements does weigh on you physically. I certainly do believe that there, in addition to what black people are exposed to in the physical environment, poorer air quality, poorer water quality, the stress of having to navigate a lie for 500 years and counting does have physical impacts that can lead to hypertension and stroke. You're talking to someone whose mother died of a stroke at 57 years old, despite being a tenured professor with access to pretty damn good health care. You know, her heart surgery was performed by the same cardiologist that performed Bill Clinton's heart surgery, Dr. Wayne Isom. We'll always we'll remember that guy. But even having that access, I mean, just all of that, of navigating every day of like, I've got 2 PhDs, you know what I mean? I'm a tenured professor and I still have to deal with racism. You know, when I pick my son up, you know, at one of his friend's house who live on Riverside Drive, the doorman asking if she's the cleaning lady, you know what I mean? Like, and just having to like navigate all of that while also
have you read Joy DeGruy's book, Post-Traumatic Slave Syndrome?
My goodness. Absolutely.
Yeah.
Absolutely.
I mean,
it's a must read.
Yeah. I mean, it was stunning for me as a white person. It was really inside view of what it's like today, in the sense of that slavery's still here, as kind of my as what I took away from that book, which, you know, that question of equality and justice, you know, still remains elusive, you know, in many realms, but clearly it's still the case, you know, for the Black community in the United States. You know,
absolutely.
You know, we were kind of moving historically. You know, you've got the Civil War amendments, as they're called, coming in. You know, 13th, 14th, 15th Amendment. You had what was, you know, in a lot of ways, people called the Second American Revolution. That this idea that, okay, we're moving towards, you know, in our view and our work that we do here at CELDF, you know, it was this kind of push away from a property-oriented kind of view of government to one that was supposed to be a little more based on rights, right? That you had this tension there. And so you had this moment. And of course, on the federal level, you had a lot of resources going into the you know, the Reconstruction period. As far as I know, it's the most, it was the time of which the offices were held the most by Black people compared to even today.
Yep, absolutely.
You had a very concerted effort to pass, you know, there were civil rights acts of the 1800s, right? People would think of the Civil Rights Act of the 1960s. Well, there were civil rights acts basically of the 1800s to basically animate, is my interpretation, animate the words of those constitutional amendments and make them so, or at least try to create the right conditions. Of course, that all collapsed in very short order. You know, the federal government pulls out in very brief historical, you know, encapsulation. You know, they basically moved to the north to put down labor insurrections of workers and then move their ways, of course, westward to continue the genocide of indigenous people. So they, you know, their focus went away. You know, in come the Jim Crow laws, in come, you know, the rise of the Ku Klux Klan, you know, all catalysts for the white supremacy that's still unfortunately alive and in a lot of cases doing quite well. So you've got this promise of equality. You know, you've got the Declaration saying it. Of course, it doesn't come to be. Then you've got the Civil War amendments that come to sort of as a, let's say, a reset in a way to sort of achieve that. And then it's another 100 years before you get to what you mentioned was, you know, some advancements. Maybe some of it was really more compromise about truly deep sort of justice and equality coming into play. So we're not there, right? You know, we haven't made it. We haven't really truly reckoned with racism and really the reality of white supremacy. So here we are. You know, I guess, what does that reality look like? What have you seen? Of course, we've had moments in recent history with, you know, the national news at least taking hold of certain murders, you know, whether it was Michael Brown and Ferguson, whether it's, you know, George Floyd and sort of the culmination of sort of collective efforts that have, you know, come to kind of raise the consciousness, at least in that case, around violence towards, you know, Black and brown people, and sort of the larger question of, you know, the meme of Black Lives Matter, and you know, I guess in some ways the question to you is, you know, do they? Meaning, you know what I mean?
I mean, it's really, I want to handle that question quickly because I remember, you know, sort of living in DC. I moved to DC like months before the election that led to former President Biden, right after what some people refer to as Freedom Summer. I don't necessarily share giving that moniker to what happened in the summer of 2020. But, as we get closer to the election, it was interesting, right? The Black Lives Matter signs start to slowly come down or get faded out and replaced with like Ukrainian flags. And I had this friend who was going around the city of DC and putting parentheses and ED in the parentheses on as many Black Lives Matter signs as she could find. So it read Black Lives Mattered. and it was like really, really striking, in one sense, but it was like, it was just a fad, clearly it was a flashpoint where we took to the streets. A lot of people took to the streets, Kai, just because we needed to get out of our homes, right? This is also at the height of COVID as well, and it's certainly not taking anything away from, or being reductive for people's reasons, because it was a beautiful thing to see a lot of white comrades, certainly indigenous comrades, out in the streets with Black folk. But then it culminates with the election of a centrist man, right, who literally, is not fully hearing the people, because he goes from, no, don't defund the police, fund the police, give the police more money to train them, to not be as racist. And it's like, Mr. President or Mr. President-elect, we're talking about a system. We're not talking about the specific cops that killed George Floyd. We're not talking about the specific cops that executed Breonna Taylor, et cetera, et cetera. We're talking about a system that created them. So let's not throw more money at it. And so, it reminds me, because I think another author who has saved my life, and I think the lives of many Black people, because this author articulated how many of us felt, and that is the prophet, as I call him, James Baldwin, right? And you see this evolution of James Baldwin, of going from pleading with America, like, live up to your promise, these words that you have in your Declaration of Independence and your Constitution, you're not living up to it. And then, of course, this all changes after two of Baldwin's friends and colleagues get executed, Martin Luther King and Alhaji Malik El-Shabazz, Malcolm X. And then you see just this shift, right? Quotes that Baldwin said, all of the Western nations have been caught in a lie, the lie of their pretend humanism. More quotes. He says, the big lie is about the bedrock of our society and civility as Americans. America keeps electing leaders who lie about what is happening. Americans want to hear the lie. Every white person in this country knows one thing. They would not like to be Black here. If they know that, then they know everything they need to know, and whatever else they say is a lie. So all these quotes about basically the lie, the big lie, the original big lie, right? Eddie Glaude Jr., African-American history professor at Princeton University, wrote an entire book about James Baldwin's, change in attitude, his epiphany about about the lie that upholds this nation, a foundation of mendacity, if you will. So I think that, the summer of 2020 was sort of like another, peek into what was happening. And just like in the 1960s, but we didn't leave people there to make sure that the window stayed open, and it got shut, very, very quickly, because it got quickly electoralized. And you cannot electoralize, you cannot vote out white supremacy. You can vote out white supremacists, right? Or at least I should say, du jour white supremacist, and then still give rise to de facto policy of the policies that are de facto racist and de facto white supremacists. Ibram Kendi says there is no such thing as as a not racist policy. A policy is either racist or it's anti-racist. And I think that since 2020, of course, we have been sliding in the other direction, Kai, where now literally we are seeing a Supreme Court that is even entertaining the idea that a sitting president has the right to, via executive order, upend a constitutional amendment, this being the 14th and birthright citizenship. That's incredible. And that just kind of gives you a sense of where we've come as a country. And one of those Supreme Court justices who may or may not, we don't even know, side with the president is a Black man. which goes to show you that, like, white supremacy ideology, you don't have to be white to exercise white supremacy ideology, right? You can be any race, any ethnicity, but the idea of white supremacy ideology is to keep up this lie. This particular Supreme Court Justice, Clarence Thomas, believes that it is a personal benefit to him to keep this lie, to perpetuate this lie. Maybe that's the same mode of thinking for Tim Scott, the Republican black senator from South Carolina. So that's the other element of the lie. You even have some black people believing that the only way for social mobility, or the best way for social mobility, the best way for social edification is to embrace the lie, so that, at least I'm going to benefit from it. I don't know about the rest of you, black people, but I'm going to ride this lie and benefit from it. And by the way, just to show that I'm not sort of like some neoliberal Democrat, Obama also had to accept some of this lie. And he said himself, if you pull up your bootstraps, right, and you're willing to work, anyone can make it in America. That is also rooted in a lie, because we know that there are plenty of black people who work very, very, very hard, only to see their entire savings, all of their wealth, ripped away from them, vis-a-vis the subprime mortgage collapse that they had nothing to do with hatching, and watched the people who were responsible for it get bailed out while they are left fitting the bill. That is as white supremacist as it gets, by the way. So, yeah.
Yeah. And just again, a whole other topic we could spend hours on, but literally the braiding together of economic protection pursuit, with that kind of white supremacist agenda. That's another thing that people don't want to reckon with, in the sense of the construction of the U.S. Constitution itself. It's an economic document. It's not a rights document. It's all about protecting property. And at that point, of course, enslaved people were considered property. The commercial pursuits was really the large driving agent to build that particular document, and it's still intact, right? We'll give corporations 14th Amendment right protections, but we'll have a hard time struggling to make sure that living, breathing humans actually get 14th Amendment right protection.
And you could say the same thing about the Second Amendment, right?
Or the Second Amendment. Yeah,
right?
All of these extensions towards protecting commerce, protecting property, protecting sort of the wage earning, aspect of economy, the capitalistic pursuit, those clearly are, are liable for, I think, the racist reality that we have. You have people like, William Lloyd Garrison, I think Frederick Douglass was actually at that talk in Natick, Massachusetts, there on the 4th of July. Can't remember what year it was, but he burns the Constitution in public, basically saying, this thing should have never even happened if it was going to happen in the enslavement of black people. And
that's right.
You had these other moments, where people really went deep in challenging, the thing that's really propelling us and keeping us where we're at. And then, even little things that I don't think a lot of people understand, even around the Civil Rights Act of the 1960s, it got its legal power because they attached it to something called the Commerce Clause in the U.S. Constitution, because the rationale, legally speaking, was you can't deny black people access to the theaters, you can't deny black people access to a motel room, you can't deny black people's access to the railroads, because you're interfering with commerce. You're interfering with an exchange of money. And, that is sacrosanct, regardless of the color of your skin, right, is kind of how one should read that. It's all about the money.
It's all about the money.
And we'll extend now what seem like rights protections to a class of people, to a group of people, but we're not doing it because we're really seeing the people. Your case in point around being at the conference you're at, we're not really seeing people. But we will see money. And so,
right. If you think about it, right, just quickly to your point, when Dr. King and, his group, right, SCLC, Southern Christian Leadership Council, when they did what was known today as Plan C in Birmingham, right, it wasn't the Birmingham government that ended segregation. it was the business owners who were like, look, like, we can't take this financial hit anymore, and whatever, we'll just make money off of them too. So like let them shop in our stores. It wasn't out of benevolence or this grand epiphany that racism and white supremacy is wrong. It was that if we can still benefit ourselves, we'll stomach. I'm seeing them, and eventually, integration turned into something that at the end of the day benefited capital and the holders of capital more than it certainly has benefited Black people, brown people, indigenous people as a whole, right? This goes back to something that one of my great teachers and mentors, Kali Akuno from Cooperation Jackson, he wrote a book about the Jackson Kush plan, right? Jackson Rising, and broke it down in like really one paragraph. I always quote Kali's paragraph of basically like, look, after slavery, Black people basically became a surplus population in the United States now that they were no longer property per se, and that they could be used for free labor. And when you have this surplus population, there's three ways to deal with them, right? Counterinsurgency, as we saw with COINTELPRO, Black Panther Party, etc., and squash, violently if necessary, any with counterinsurgency. Two, elite capture some of them vis-a-vis Obamas and the Clarence Thomases so that you can control them more. And then third is mass incarceration and murder. Just get rid of them, like remove them. But at the end of the day, it's all about serving capital until we can't serve capital anymore. We're in that era now, close to that era now, in this advent of AI and this advent of data centers, right? What's going to happen to a population that's already seen as a surplus population? What I said to Kali is like, and this speaks to why I'm here in Colombia now, is another stratagem I would add is contaminate them. Contaminate them as part of killing them vis-a-vis environmental racism, situate them near the most toxic, refineries and processes like Cancer Alley in Louisiana, taint their water with lead, as we saw in Flint, Michigan, and in general, just situate them in places where the air is terrible to breathe, the land is too contaminated to grow on, and essentially just, with a form of slow genocide, if you will, just, kill them off by exposing them to this stuff. So, all of that I think still applies, to what you were saying about 13th, 14th, and 15th. Like in the same way that we're asking ourselves, what did the Declaration of Independence mean? What does the 13th, 14th, and 15th mean today, right? In this context, when we are seeing, certainly, as my partner likes to say, white supremacy in Book of Revelation mode, right? So
I'm curious what you have seen, what you believe, what you have read. What are some of the main things that are just locking down that narrative of white supremacy? As one example, maybe to get into that, I just finished reading How the Word is Passed by Clint Smith, and it's his own reckoning, his own journey. It's very well written in his investigation into his own history, the realities of today. And he comes through different doorways, right? He visits old plantations. He actually goes to Africa to see where enslaved people were captured before being, shipped across the Atlantic. But one of his stories is about going to a Confederate cemetery on I can't remember what day it was, and talking with the people there who are, related to that period of history, and they're not just keeping memories alive, they're keeping a false narrative alive about what the Revolutionary War was all about. So you've got that element amongst maybe whatever else to my question I asked you around just narrative, but clearly from reading that, I'm like, oh, well, that's definitely a piece of what's keeping things, from changing, keeping that hard reckoning from happening, keeping us to getting as a collective towards what I would call right relationship. But I'm curious, what is that narrative or those narratives that you think are just keeping things as they are? And of course, I got a kind of follow-up question that in some ways they're trying to even reinforce it. They're not even just keeping the old whatever narrative going, they're trying to actually, I wouldn't say evolve it. They're trying to like reinforce it in a way that, of
Right.
course, is maintaining this separation, maintaining the inequality, maintaining the injustice that that's happening.
Well, I mean, it's interesting. I think I'll answer, this very salient question in two ways, right? It's easy to answer that as it pertains to conservative, what we would refer to as right-wing people. So we're going to answer that second. But what I would say is like really reinforcing it are white liberals and white progressives. Dr. Robin DiAngelo in her book White Fragility says, if I'm being honest, it's white progressives that give people of color, and in this case, speak specifically about black people, the hardest time. And what I respect about DiAngelo is she includes herself in it, right? To the extent that we think that we've made it rather than doing the work that we need to do. And I'll say this to you as a black person, being in some of these purported leftist spaces, so-called Democratic Socialists of America, Indivisible, 50-51, these are very white dominated spaces that still try to dictate to black people how they should think, how they should vote, who they should vote for. And in some cases, even telling them your race doesn't matter. It's all about class, right? I call them e-racists because they want to erase racism. And, they're perpetuating this as well, that with a few tweaks to the economy, with a few tweaks, into the electoral process, we can liberate all people, right? Let's give an example of that. A person who I advise and somewhat work for, Bernie Sanders, despite his racial blind spots, had this idea that if we get Medicare for all, Anthony, black people will automatically be taken care of. And I'm like, no, dude, that's just not true. The greatest tennis player of either gender, arguably in the world, almost died while giving birth to her child, Serena Williams. Undisputably the GOAT. Serena Williams is a part owner of a football team, so I think she had access to healthcare, right? This cannot be disputed. What she didn't have access to was justice in healthcare, right? Which is why even with all of her wealth, she almost died while giving birth to her child. The same thing could be said for Abby Phillips from CNN, right? Abby is not poor. I don't necessarily agree with all of Abby's politics, but she did a whole symposium on how she almost died while giving birth to a child. So that's one element that's lifting it up. It's just like liberals, white progressives who still dictate to African Americans and black people, stay in this Democrat Party. Where else are you going to go? You're the backbone of the party, right? Black people then go out and put a lot on the line, especially during COVID, right? When we know that there was a higher COVID morbidity rate for black people. The only folk who had a higher morbidity rate was our indigenous comrades, right? But black people are going out, risking it. They elect this guy and they don't see their material conditions improve that much at all, maybe for a few. Right. So that's perpetuating it. So that's how it is on the center and on the left. Right. This idea of stick with us and we have your best we have your best interests at heart, when really what it is we just need your vote to maintain a status quo that primarily benefits white working class and even more so white affluent people, right? I always say that the people who I find the most difficulty dealing with, and I even sometimes say in frustration to my partner, I can't stand them, are Bay Area white liberals and progressives and Los Angeles County white progressives, because it's just like look at your cities and states, guy, or your cities and your state. You're the biggest contradiction in the world. You're the fourth biggest economy in the world, and you are tied with Louisiana for the highest poverty rate in the United States of America. Louisiana, we know about Louisiana. This was a slave state. California was not. So, right there, you see that contradiction. On the
I don't know
right,
about you. I know.
Oh,
I
go
know
ahead. Yeah.
I know you're in Nebraska now, but I mean, our experience as an organization. Well, what I'm getting at is our experience in the organization is, I think the most progressive possibilities have come out of what people would label very conservative communities. They don't come out of the ones that people want to point to, the Berkeleys or the Boulders or the LAs, or they're coming out of, I would say, places with real people who are really connected. And I think it clearly blows the white liberals away when you talk about that, because we've had the very same experience you've had, Anthony,
Yes.
just
Speaking
with
to
that
rural
group of people of
Nebraskans.
they're
Yes.
barriers.
Yes. Yes. I mean, look, man, when I co-founded an organization in Nebraska called Regenerate Nebraska, and the idea, and the idea still, is to help mainly small family farmers transition, or transform, I should say, from industrial forms of agriculture, the pesticides, the soil tilling, et cetera, to more regenerative practices as a process of eventually getting them to the fully organic, right? Which takes time. I've had some of the greatest conversations with these real grown men crying, and us crying together and holding hands and whatnot, because they do get it. And what really blew me away was, I knew, one gentleman who I was speaking to was a Trump supporter. Didn't matter to me that much because we were still fighting for the same thing. And he takes me to his office and he shows me all of these pictures from 1988 when Jesse Jackson was in his home and on his farm, and he supported Jesse Jackson. And he asked me, Anthony, tell me that. How do I go from supporting Jesse Jackson in 1988 to supporting Donald Trump in 2016? And I had answers for him. I said, because you've been forgotten by both parties, but especially these coastal elite liberals and progressives who just look down on you, right? Who don't think that you're intelligent at all, and who don't think that you have a contribution other than to provide them with services. Gee, you know how I know that? Because I don't have sympathy. I have empathy, because that's also how a lot of these liberals, progressives, and the country as a whole have and continue to feel about Black people and brown people.
Do you think
as well.
that story there, do you think that's kind of the counter narrative, the counter approach to really undoing potentially, or, I mean, obviously eventually, the complete extinction of racism would be the ideal, but let's say, what's going to move us there? Is it these kinds of experiences, these kind of connections, these kind of community building, finding the things that, hey, this matters to all of us, and then let's use those opportunities just to get to know each other?
Absolutely.
I mean, is that kind of what's driving you?
I mean, I am honored to serve on the board of directors with Friends of the Earth, United States, one of the larger environmental organizations. We have this president, Eric Pica. He's from Michigan. Eric and I have known each other for, oh my gosh, going on like 12 years now. In addition to being a friend, he's been a mentor, he's been a confidant and whatnot. And he, on their staff, there's this brilliant woman named Ariel Mojer. And, Ariel let us know about this plan to start talking to people from the Make America Healthy Again, movement, let's go ahead and call it. And of course, first I had some skepticisms naturally, but it turned out to be such an exciting program. They're having incredible conversations. And Ariel, who I have some of my favorite debates with, and Ariel is one of those people who knows how to call me out on my BS in a way that is loving. Right? And I dig her for that and so many more things. It's like, wait a second, like you went and had these conversations with these rural, farmers in Nebraska, and you come back and reported to us some of the greatest conversations you've had. I was like, I remember you saying you've had better conversations with them than you have had with white environmentalists in our guild. And she was absolutely right. Don't get into arguments with people, by the way, that have photographic memories, because you will always lose that argument. But nonetheless, now you have a swath of environmental organizations reaching out to Eric and Ariel, asking, how did you do that? What did you do? How are you speaking to Mega? And Eric, who his brilliance comes from just being able to simplify seemingly complicated ideas, said, we just listened to them. Right? Like, we just simply went into their communities and listened to them. We didn't go in with like an agenda, right? And it's the same approach that I took when a former colleague of mine were going into Western Nebraska and, the areas of Nebraska that were totally red, but it's like, we're not going to go in there and bludgeon them with like, you have to believe in climate change. You have to be on the same side of us when it comes to reproductive justice, et cetera, right? Not get into this ideological battle. Here's the deal, right? You're being screwed over by big ag, right? We're being screwed over by big ag. You're working yourself to death, and your kids do not even want to be farmers, which means you may have to sell your farm. And as I've learned, the first rule of family farm is keep the farm in the family. What can we do together? By the way, Kai, like, it turns out that doing regenerative agriculture is good for the climate. So it's like, having raised a 5-year-old who's now 11 and about to raise another young one, I can tell you this: the best way to get your children to do something is not to tell them directly what you want them to do. It's because they're going to resist that. But most importantly, Kai, we went in, and I can send you pictures of just having dinner with human beings, and just listening and creating those relationships. That's what Ariel and Eric and Friends of the Earth are doing with Maha, building off of the great Adrienne Marie Brown, right? One of the inventors of emergent strategy. And Adrienne said, like, from the outset, critical connections must come before critical mass. So to answer your overarching question, yes, enough of red, blue, enough of conservative, progressive, enough of urban, rural, right? Jesse Jackson did it in '88 when he's going into these impoverished rural communities, whether it was Nebraska or Appalachia. He basically was saying, I'm not seeing anything different from what I see in the south side of Chicago, except the complexion of the people who are suffering, which builds off, of course, of the great genius of another great Chicagoan, the great Fred Hampton, who, of course, started the original Rainbow Coalition and was so effective, in bringing people together that it looks like, pretty much our country's FBI executed him before the dude even turned 22.
Yeah. So now you've got that, let's say that example, that experience, that those sort of points of vibrancy that are happening, right? Because it's not just, I know it's not just happening in Nebraska, it's happening in other places. Simultaneously, you've got two corporations dictating, they don't dictate, they become the spokespeople that dictate policy. And the corporations, I mean the Democrats and the Republican Party, which people don't realize they're actually corporations. And, they're doing the bidding of the 1%, the powerful elite. You've got actions coming out of that same government that may be talking about make America healthy again, canceling, DEI programs, trying to erase Black history, going back to earlier talking about truth telling and how are you supposed to know the truth if you can't actually be exposed to it? There's all these actions happening that actually are going, one can say, completely backwards, or just reinforcing that other narrative we spoke of around keeping white supremacy alive, even though you and others are doing the right kind of work to try to crumble that edifice, and sort of bringing it to a point here. You just wrote a piece where you quote Frederick Douglass, which a lot of people love to quote his.
It's pretty easy.
Conceding power. But I think what people don't usually get around that quote is what comes before and after the chunk that usually people pull out, which is the struggle part, whether it's driven by the moral, whether it's driven by the physical. So, like, I guess, where are we at, Anthony? Where's our potential? Are we really truly ready to struggle collectively, ideally? And you mentioned earlier, just the other means really of there's the physical incarceration largely pointed at people of color clearly, but also this psychological one that continues through corporate media, but also now this explosion of the use of artificial intelligence and how that is already clearly dulling critical thinking skills. It's locking us in. It's about ultra entertainment. It's about hyperconsumption. It's all these things that really just not only freeze us in place, but begin to truly, I think, in a way, sever those synapses, because I've always been of the mind, doing the community organizing work that I do, that we still have it. We still have it in us to actually succeed in the struggle. But now there's new pressures coming in that I'm beginning to think, holy cow, they're really almost re-engineering
Yeah.
people to the point like, we are almost certain if we continue on this course to sign our own death certificates, because in the end, we will die off by our
That's
own
right.
actions.
That's
all
right.
of humanity, regardless of the color of
No,
your
no,
skin.
right. It's not about, I mean,
Yeah.
we're talking to each other on Earth Day, right? A day
Yeah. So
where,
here we are as warriors to change that, to incite the right kind of struggle. And so looking at the Black experience and how that connects to everything else, I guess in simple terms, what is it going to take? Is it going to take more of what you just explained earlier? Are there other elements that have to come into play? I mean, again, this is a big question, but maybe just taking a shot at it.
I'm going to try my best to answer. I want to start with hope and some positive aspects, right? Ariel, who I just spoke about, Eric, they always try to say to me, like, I'm a polemicist by nature. I think that's because I was raised by an African British woman in part. But okay, the city that I grew up in, an artery of global capitalism, a city that has a street that is literally named after a wall to keep out the indigenous people from that island of Manhattan, right? From being able to move freely, is now presided over by a 34-year-old Muslim immigrant from Africa, by the way, so-called democratic socialist, that basically had to confront power, as you were said, from both corporations, the Democrat Party Corporation and the Republican Party Corporation, and vanquished both of them contemporaneously, I might add, through 100,000 volunteers, which is unheard of, right? I mean, there is no Mayor Zoran Mamdani without the 100,000 volunteers. He probably made a bit of money. New York City does have this thing with matching funds, which I think is a great model. And of course, ranked choice voting certainly helped him. So that type of thing can happen, right? And we saw it happen in a place where I think people are making it seem like it's more likely than it isn't. Like New York City isn't like this, lolly progressive land. It's a gangster place, like you have to do some navigating with a gangster city council and a gangster capitalist establishment to boot. It's not like just like anyone who has progressive ideas can just easily get elected in New York City. So let's dispel that myopic myth too. So that happened. What does that, necessarily mean, though, in terms of like, where do we go from here? Let's talk about where the guild that I work in, the nonprofit, mostly environmental civil society organization, go. This is one of the most racist, classist guilds in the world. I would probably experience less racism, less placism, and less classism if I went and worked for the fossil fuel industry. That's an honest truth, Kai. Like the fossil fuel industry would be going out of their way to make sure that I could not file a discrimination lawsuit against them and handle any issues of discrimination that I experience with fervor. So it's interesting. To your question, some of the institutions that are purportedly fighting the system probably have to go and be totally restructured. I've said like we can't fight the system and the system that's supposed to be fighting the system. This sort of like nonprofit guild, that like the vast majority of it, we have to get rid of it, right? And we have organizations in the environmental sector where executive directors are getting paid over $1 million a year. Why do they still have nonprofit status? Because they're actually working. They're complicit with what we're seeing. So in some institutions, we are going to have to accept that they are rotten to the core because they've been elite captured, and we're going to have to get rid of them. So there's that too. Now, this is the hard part. 250 years. That's a good run for any empire. That's a really good run. We've seen what it has taken for other empires to either fall outright or be transformed outright. Mesopotamia, Ottoman, British, it's Austro-Hungarian, etc., etc. People will have to, I think, embrace the fact that there are elements of violence that are probably inevitable. Like, and that doesn't mean go out and seek violence. That doesn't mean go out and start killing people. I'm not advocating for that as much as I'm going back to the ethos of what Douglas was saying, where like it may have to be physical. And if you're not ready for that, you're not really ready for, like Bernie Sanders says, a political revolution. What the hell does that mean, Senator Sanders? Right?
Yeah.
Revolutions are about, as the great Amilcar Cabral, big great Pan-Africanist, said, a revolution is simple. It's about seizing the means of production and returning it to the workers. That's all a revolution is, right? Cabral tried to be very, very simple in his very, very intricate way of seeing the world. And so that's not going to come, as to Douglas's point, with, you know, the ruling class saying, you know what, we were wrong. We're going to just give it to you. And you can see that because you named data centers, you named AI. Who are the biggest proponents of universal basic income right now? Musk, Altman. Not because they're benevolent, but because they know that they are creating a larger surplus population who will eventually have nothing and turn to violence. That they're just trying to prevent a violent uprising. Sam Altman knows this better than anybody, right? I mean, look what just happened with him with the Molotov cocktail. So I think that those are, and then I think there just needs to be this massive awakening to the fact that what this discussion with you and I is all about. We have been living in a lie for 250 years. It's like, again, I'm bringing it back to the Matrix because I call it the Matrix effect. When Morpheus is saying to Neo, when Morpheus basically is like, yeah, man, you've been living in a dreamland. You've been living in a lie, and it's going to take white progressives, white liberals, as well as white conservatives. And I think that we're seeing this awakening happening with conservatives more, ironically. My God, Kai, we talked earlier, like I'm agreeing with Marjorie Taylor Greene more than I am with many of the Democrat establishment. I'm agreeing with elements of Marjorie Taylor Greene. I want to be clear, elements of Tucker Carlson. Look at what we're seeing, the most ardent data center fights happening, rural communities, right? So-called red congressional districts, Republicans hating data centers, or opposing them, I should say, by a factor of 9 points higher than Democrats and 6 points higher than independents. That awakening seems to be happening more so there than we are seeing in some of the more progressive cities that we name, San Francisco Bay Area, Los Angeles, et cetera, et cetera. And that's because their material conditions are being directly impacted in ways that they're feeling it. So that awakening is going to have to happen on the other side. And then finally, what I'll say is that we're just going to have to look at these contradictions that are surfacing, that are becoming more elucidated about this 250-year lie, and see them just as that. Not, go and say to a Trump supporter, ha ha, this is what you get. Bring them in. Have space for, if you're awake, have space for people who are in the process of awakening, and understand that you too are living a lie. These Trump supporters have manifested that lie more directly by voting for a particular candidate. But come on, Democrats, Clinton did a lot of things, that weren't great for working class people. NAFTA, repealing Glass-Steagall, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. Obama bailed out the people who made a lot of people poor rather than the people. So you've also been perpetuating that lie. So this great awakening is going to have to happen. But yes, I mean, 250 years, like you named a bloody civil war that was in part necessary for somewhat abolition of chattel enslaved people. Yes, embracing as hard as it may be for people that there's going to be some skirmishes, probably as part of navigating where we want to go and how people react to the fact that they've been lied to. They got to get it out somehow, and let's not put them all on bad medication and give the pharmaceutical industry even more money. Let's figure out how to deal with that trauma that's going to be collective as more people awaken.
Yeah. No, I really, really appreciate the pulling out. If we're in a revolutionary moment, what is it going to take, right? I think there's a couple key things that I really resonated with. One, you talked about there's going to be real conflict, and some of that conflict is most likely going to be physical. Like that's just part of how bigger transformations, revolutions operate, right? And in our own United States history is the case, whether it's the Revolutionary War, whether it's the fight for abolition, whether it's suffragism for the right to vote for women, whether it's the civil rights. I mean, they all became physical in one way or the other. And it was those physical moments that could be argued as what propelled then the system's changes, whether they held in place or not, like we were talking about earlier around the Civil War amendments or not. That's a different conversation. But they all got physical. And guess what? In all those cases, they broke the law. They were lawbreakers.
Yes. Yes.
These were lawbreakers. And so, we're always trying to get people to understand you have to get to that point, because so long as you move in lockstep to what you're being told and you have obedience towards it, you continue to legitimize all these institutions. You legitimize the racism, you legitimize the white supremacy, you legitimize the power imbalance, the wealth discrepancy that's, just grown bigger and bigger between the haves and the have-nots. Disobedience is actually, again, going back to the Declaration, it was about writing permission to be disobedient.
Yes.
And so I guess if you're going to pull from that 250 years ago, that document, that is a key element, I think, that people have to come to grips with. The other two things I think that are critical is really becoming, you got to understand where connections and collaborations and communities should be built from, and then what things have to be let go of and do not invest there, right? And those were also moments where there were splits, right, in history between the suffragists or the abolitionists or even the civil rights movement, and it was the splits that became, let's say, more physical and more radicalized, that helped push things through. They had to let that other stuff go away. In some cases, they had to make efforts to kill it off entirely, because it became a barrier to, much in the same way I think you talked about white liberals being a real barrier to maybe getting it to a better place where it's come to racism.
Well, I mean, and just to be clear, I want to add that you could say the same thing of the black petty bourgeois, right? Like Edward Frazier, really also blew my mind. He's a graduate of my alma mater, Clark University in Worcester, Massachusetts. The black bourgeoisie. Let's talk about where we've seen that as well, like the NFL. Okay, where Colin Kaepernick was left on an island with people who have full ability to take part in a general strike. These are millionaires, and you know how racist the NFL is if you're a black football player and you're not willing to confront that power when you see what they're doing. And that also is a lack of discipline, right? And I think that, to your point of like going back to Frederick Douglass, you want all of this. You don't want to do the plowing. You don't want it to rain, but you still want crops to grow. And you want all this freedom and all this justice, but you're not willing to stand with Kaepernick over a game where you've got millions of dollars, in the bank, and even if there are some of your black people who don't have as much as others, y'all could pool your money. You know how I know that? Because people who are not millionaires were able to do that in a little town in Alabama, or county in Alabama called Montgomery. And then there was, I think, more discipline, quite frankly, than we're seeing now, even from some of the more radical black movements of like, am I really willing to give up this imperial mode of living that I even enjoy as a black person in the global north? Because look at what we've seen. No shade, again, Minneapolis, spirited organizing, but a one weekend general strike, that's not a general strike. It wasn't the Montgomery bus boycott, for 2 days. It was the Montgomery bus boycott until we win, and understanding that there had to be sacrifice. So we can't even see that for multimillionaire basketball players, multimillionaire athletes who are black writ large, in the pursuit of black liberation. I mean, we also have to make sure that we are calling them in as well. We cannot let them escape with impunity for their complicity in a system that uses them for entertainment and pays them by as rich as they are, a fraction of what the NFL is a multi-billion-dollar nonprofit industry, as is the NBA, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And we still don't have an equal representation. To your idea about DEI, some of the worst people when it comes to DEI are nonprofit spaces, specifically the Environmental Guild and the NFL. Right? I mean, you had asked a question about affirmative action when we were emailing, and I'll say this: I hate that there has to be affirmative action. That sucks. That it's even necessary, right? And the same thing could be said of DEI. But like, if we're going to go and talk about corporations who, by the way, probably are more diverse than the average nonprofit and certainly more diverse than an institution like the NFL, right? This was a year when like 8 or 9 head coaches got fired. And I don't think, if I'm not mistaken, maybe one was replaced by a black man in a league that is majority black. And players are still just going to be like, yep, let's go sacrifice our bodies anyway. So there's a black petty bourgeois that also have to be called in and showcased for allowing the system that maybe benefits them personally, but does not benefit their people, as they like to call us, collectively. And that individualism is another element of how white supremacy ideology and the lie of the Declaration of Independence, right? Remember, like, all men are created equal, but not collectively. If you do your thing and you benefit, then you've made it. But don't worry about what happened to Colin Kaepernick. Just keep looking at your bank account. Don't worry about the fact that like all of these players could easily pull their money together to address black poverty specifically. Why is that not happening? That is also, I believe, an impact and a symptom of buying into the lie of the Declaration of Independence, buying into the lie of American exceptionalism, regardless of your race. Because I've made it, so if you didn't make it, that's something that you're doing, right? Yeah. And that's important.
Well, Anthony, thanks so much for making the time, and especially with all your busyness and where you're at, and it's. Well,
we're keeping in touch, man. You have no choice on that.
No, for sure.
Now I'm gonna institute some black supremacy and saying these conversations have been great. I have to stay in touch with you, and we're gonna have to meet each other in 3D as well, because I insist on that. Yeah.
Just thinking the same thing. I'm so looking forward to actually being physically around you and just having more chances just to I guess in very crude terms, shoot the shit.
Absolutely.
I want to thank you for listening to our show and let you know a few ways you can support Truth and Reckoning. First, share this broadcast with your friends and family. Leave a positive review via your podcast app. Visit the Truth and Reckoning YouTube channel and leave a thumbs up and a comment. The full scope of the work of CELDF, including this show, comes with a financial cost. So if you're able to make a donation, go to CELDF.org. That's CELDF.org. But most importantly, our goal for this show is to empower you to take action. So the best way you can show your support is to get involved with your community and protecting the place where you live. Thank you very much.